The, ra- the rain on 125th didn't wash the city clean, it just made the grime slicker. It was 3 in the morning, the hour when the devil counts his money, and the only light on the block came from the flickering neon sign of a diner that should have closed hours ago. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and impending death. A man sat alone in a booth near the back. He wasn't facing the door. He was reading a newspaper, the pages turning with a slow, deliberate rustle that sounded like thunder in the silence of the room. He wore a gray suit, tailored to perfection, the kind of fabric that costs more than a factory worker makes in a year. On the table, next to his coffee cup, sat a silver cigarette case. No gun, no knife, just the silver case and the black coffee. Outside, a dark sedan rolled to a stop, the headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the raindrops like falling diamonds before dying out. The engine ticked as it cooled. 3 men stepped out. They wore heavy wool coats and fedoras pulled low. They moved with the heavy, arrogant gait of men who were used to being the predators. They were from downtown. They spoke a different language, ate different food, and prayed to a different version of the same God. They had come uptown with a simple instruction: remove the obstacle. They didn't know the obstacle was waiting for them. They didn't know that the man in the booth had counted the seconds between the car door slamming and the diner door opening. He knew their weight, he knew their intent, and he knew that by the time they walked out, if they walked out, their understanding of the world would be shattered. The bell above the door chimed. It was a cheerful sound, entirely out of place. The 3 men entered. The wind blew in behind them, cold and wet. The man in the booth didn't turn around. He didn't flinch. He just turned another page of the newspaper. The leader of the trio, a man with a scar running through his eyebrow, reached into his coat. He didn't draw the weapon, but he gripped the handle, letting the leather creak. He walked toward the booth. His footsteps were heavy on the linoleum. He stopped 2 feet away. He waited for the man to look up, to beg, to scramble, to show fear, but the man in the booth just sighed, a mild annoyance, and folded the paper. He picked up his coffee, took a sip, and finally, slowly, turned his head. His eyes were not angry, they were empty, empty of fear, empty of hesitation, empty of the deference these men demanded from everyone else in this city. He looked at the Italian hitman the way a scientist looks at a bacteria sample. If you're drawn to the untold stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The hitman opened his mouth to speak, to deliver the ultimatum he had rehearsed, but the words died in his throat, because in that split second of eye contact, he realized a terrifying truth. He realized that the gun in his coat didn't make him the most dangerous thing in the room. He realized that they hadn't walked into a hit, they had walked into a test, and they were already failing. This story was never meant to be written down. The police files from that night are empty. The Mafia's internal records, the meticulously kept ledgers of debts and hits, have a gap where this man's name should be. For decades, the history books told a sanitized version of organized crime in New York. They told a story of 5 families who carved up the city and ruled with absolute authority. They told a story where Harlem was just a territory to be conquered, a cash cow to be milked by men in silk suits from Mulberry Street. That narrative is a lie. It is a fabrication designed to protect the egos of men who claim to be kings but were afraid of the dark. The truth is much colder. The truth is that there was a line on the map that the five families were terrified to cross, not because of the police, not because of the politicians, but because of one man who understood the physics of power better than they did. By the time this hour is over, you will understand why the most ruthless killers in American history checked under their beds for a man who played chess while they played checkers. But to understand the fear, you have to understand the man before the myth. Before he was a kingpin, before he was a legend, he was just a target. Imagine waking up every single morning with a weight on your chest so heavy it makes it hard to breathe. This wasn't the weight of guilt, it was the weight of expectation. He was born into a world that told him from his first breath that he was less, that his intellect was a threat, that his ambition was a crime. He watched his father, a man of dignity, have to step off the sidewalk into the mud to let white men pass. He saw the fire in his mother's eyes dim a little more every time she had to swallow her pride to put food on the table. He carried a rage inside him that was different from the hot, explosive anger of the streets. It was a cold, blue flame, a fusion reactor of resentment and brilliance. He realized very early on that in America there are two kinds of laws, the ones written on paper and the ones written in blood. The paper laws were designed to keep him down. The blood laws were the only ones that offered a way out. He didn't want to be a gangster because he loved violence. He hated the chaos of it. He wanted to be a gangster because it was the only boardroom that would let him sit at the head of the table. But the cost of that seat was isolation. He couldn't show weakness. He couldn't show doubt. Even when his hands trembled, and they did tremble, in the dark when no one was watching, he had to freeze his face into an absolute certainty. He knew that the moment he looked human, the wolves would eat him alive. The Italians called him the professor behind his back. It was meant to be an insult, a mocking nickname for a black man who read Shakespeare and philosophy. But when they said it to his face, the mockery vanished, because they saw how he applied those books. They saw how he entered a room. He didn't stride in like a conqueror. He drifted in like smoke. One moment, the room was loud, chaotic, full of laughter and arguments. The next, the volume would drop, not to silence, but to a hush, a murmur. Men who were mid-sentence would stop, look at their drinks, and lower their voices. It wasn't because he shouted, it was because he radiated a gravitational pull. He would find a corner, sit down, and simply observe. He noticed everything. He noticed who was drinking too much. He noticed who was sweating. He noticed who was looking at the door too often. He gathered information like a miser gathers pennies, knowing that a secret is worth more than a bullet. The escalation began slowly. It always does. It started with a number. The numbers game. The illegal lottery that was the lifeblood of the Harlem economy. For years it was a local operation, run by local bankers, feeding local families. But the Great Depression didn't just hit the poor, it hit the mob. The Italians, led by the volatile beer baron psychopath Dutch Schultz, looked uptown and saw millions of dollars changing hands. They didn't see a community. They saw a resource to be strip-mined. Schultz sent his men in. They didn't ask. They beat the runners. They smashed the storefronts. They kidnapped the bankers. They brought the brutal industrial violence of the Prohibition era to the streets of Harlem. They expected the locals to fold. They expected them to run to the police who were already on Schultz's payroll, or to simply give up. And many did. Fear is a powerful solvent. It dissolves loyalty. But then Schultz's men hit a collection spot on 135th Street. They beat a young runner, a kid barely out of high school, leaving him broken in an alley. They took the bag. They laughed about it over spaghetti in East Harlem. What they didn't know was that the kid was under the protection of the man in the gray suit. The next morning, the bag was returned. It was sitting on the hood of Schultz's personal car, parked outside his headquarters. The money was all there, every cent. But on top of the money was a book, a copy of The Prince by Machiavelli. And inside the book, marking a specific page, was a single white chess pawn. It was a message that confused Schultz, a man who solved problems with a Tommy gun. He didn't understand the nuance. He saw it as a challenge, but he didn't see the trap. He screamed at his captains. He demanded a head. He sent more men uptown, heavily armed, with orders to burn everything down until the professor was found. The city held its breath. The streets of Harlem became a war zone, but it was a strange, silent war. Schultz's men would kick down doors, only to find empty rooms. They would corner a lieutenant, only to find he had vanished through a rooftop passage that wasn't on the blueprints. They were fighting a ghost. The man in the gray suit was nowhere, and he was everywhere. He was using the terrain against them. He knew every alley, every cellar, every secret passage between the brownstones. He turned the neighborhood into a fortress without building a single wall. Then came the night at the warehouse. Schultz, frustrated and bleeding money, demanded a sit-down. He didn't intend to execute. He called for a meeting in neutral territory, a warehouse near the river. He brought 6 men. He brought machine guns. He sat at a table under a single hanging bulb, his face twisted in a permanent snarl of entitlement. The man in the gray suit arrived alone. He walked into the warehouse. The echo of his footsteps was the only sound. He carried nothing. He walked up to the table where Schultz sat surrounded by his executioners. Schultz smiled, a shark smelling blood. "You're a brave man," Schultz sneered, "or a stupid one. You come here alone?" "I'm not alone," the man said. His voice was calm, barely a whisper, yet it carried to the darkest corners of the warehouse. "I don't see your army," Schultz laughed. "I see a dead man in a nice suit." "Look up," the man said. Schultz frowned. He looked up into the rafters. Darkness. "Look closer." Schultz squinted, and then he saw it. The glint of metal, the dull reflection of light on a barrel, then another, then another. High in the catwalks, hidden in the shadows, were a dozen men. They weren't holding Tommy guns. They were holding hunting rifles. High-powered, precise, aimed directly at the heads of Schultz and his crew. "My men aren't like yours, Dutch," the man said, pulling out a chair and sitting down. "Yours spray bullets and hope they hit something. Mine hunt. They don't miss." Schultz froze. The dynamic in the room flipped instantly. The predator was now the prey. The man in the gray suit reached into his pocket. The 6 Italian gunmen twitched, terrified, but they didn't move. They knew that if they raised a weapon, they would be dead before they pulled the trigger. The man pulled out his cigarette case. He lit a cigarette, the flame steady in his hand. "We need to talk about the tax," the man said, exhaling smoke into Schultz's face. "The tax is 0. You stay downtown. I stay uptown. If your men cross 110th Street, they don't come back. If you touch a runner, you lose a captain. If you touch a banker, you lose a warehouse. You think you can threaten the syndicate? Schultz whispered, his face purple with suppressed rage. Luciano won't stand for this. Luciano is a businessman. You are a rabid dog. Lucky knows that a dog that bites everyone eventually gets put down. Who do you think told me you were going to be here tonight? The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man's soul. The betrayal hung in the air. The man in the gray suit had not just outflanked Schultz physically. He had outflanked him politically. He had gone to the highest levels of the Mafia, to Luciano himself, and made a case. He had argued that Schultz was bad for business, that war was expensive, that cooperation, silent, invisible cooperation, was profitable. Schultz stood up. He was shaking. He knew he had lost. He knew that if he gave the order to fire, he would die. And even if he survived, Luciano would finish the job. He spat on the floor. This isn't over. It was over before you got in the car. Schultz and his men left. They walked out of the warehouse with their heads down. The man in the gray suit sat there for a moment longer. He finished his cigarette. He didn't look up at the rafters. He didn't signal his men. He just stood up, straightened his tie, and walked out into the night. But the story didn't end there. Victory in the underworld is a perishable good. By humiliating Schultz, he had painted a target on his back that was visible from every borough. The other families watched. They saw a black man dictate terms to a white boss. It terrified them. It upset the natural order of their universe. They wondered, if he can do this to Schultz, what can he do to us? They tried to freeze him out. They cut off his supply of liquor. They pressured the judges to deny him bail. They tried to buy his lieutenants, but they kept hitting the same wall. The man didn't operate on greed. He operated on loyalty. He paid for the funerals. He paid for the tuitions. He handed out turkeys on Thanksgiving, not for charity, but for insurance. Every person in Harlem was a potential set of eyes and ears for him. The true test came years later. Schultz was gone, gunned down in a bathroom in Newark. A hit sanctioned by the commission, a hit that many whispered was accelerated by the warehouse meeting. The Genovese family took over the territory. They were smoother, smarter, more corporate. They didn't want war, they wanted absorption. They invited the man to a meeting at a social club in Greenwich Village. This was the lion's den. No catwalks, no hidden snipers, just him in the heart of Italian territory. He went. He sat at a table with the heads of the 5 families. They offered him a deal, a generous deal. He could keep running Harlem, but he would report to them. He would be a capo. He would be made in everything but name. It was an altar of ultimate validation. They were offering him a seat at the highest table in crime. He looked at the contract. He looked at the men in their silk suits, men who had spent their lives underestimating him. He realized that they still didn't understand. They thought he wanted to be like them. They didn't realize he wanted to be free of them. "I am not an Italian," he said softly. "I cannot be a capo, and I will not be a servant." "Then what are you?" the head of the Genovese family asked. "I am the landlord," he replied, "and you are the tenants. You pay the rent, you stay. You don't pay the rent, you leave." He stood up and walked out. No one stopped him. No one shot him, because in that room, surrounded by the most powerful criminals in America, he possessed something they didn't. He possessed the absolute lack of fear of death. He had accepted his mortality a long time ago. To him, death was just a business expense. To them, men who loved their luxury and their lives, death was the ultimate failure. He lived for another decade. He walked the streets of Harlem without bodyguards. He sat in diners. He played chess. The Italians did business with him, but they never tried to own him again. They treated him with a strange, distant reverence, like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet. When he finally died, it wasn't in a hail of gunfire. It wasn't in a prison cell. He died of a heart attack, eating food he loved, in a place he protected. The shockwave of his death was felt all the way to Sicily. The Italians sent flowers, huge, expensive arrangements. It wasn't out of friendship, it was out of relief. The king was dead. The line on the map could finally be erased. But the line remained, because he had taught his people that power isn't given, it is taken. He taught them that silence is louder than noise. He taught them that a man with a book and a plan is more dangerous than an army with machine guns. History tries to bury men like him. It tries to paint them as thugs, as monsters, as footnotes in the stories of other men. But if you walk down 125th Street today, if you listen to the wind between the brownstones, you can still hear the echo of his silence. You can feel the weight of the man who stood in a doorway alone and made the devil blink. Power is not about controlling others. It is about controlling yourself so completely that others have no choice but to follow. He understood that, and that is why even today the Mafia remembers the name of the man they couldn't break. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe for the stories.